All right, we're now ready to introduce Europeans onto the Great Plains. And the first Europeans to make contact with any of the Plains tribes were the Spanish, who, of course, were the first Europeans in the New World overall. The specific Spaniards who first encountered the tribes of the plains were a group that ultimately wound up being led by this guy, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Yes, his last name does mean cowhead, who was initially part of a larger expedition that set out from Galveston in 1828. Most of the people on the expedition wound up dying off. Only a handful remained, and those who did sort of wandered around the American West for a couple of years, lost, trying to find their way back to other Spanish people. In addition to Cabeza de Vaca, there also was an African slave on this expedition named Esteban or Estebanito, who was probably therefore the first African American in the New World in North America. So they traveled, and you can follow the route. They kind of skirted the very, very bottom part of the southern plains, spent most of their time farther west. But they did report back when they finally reached Mexico City that they had seen herds of buffalo that were so huge it was just almost impossible to believe. And they had heard stories about places farther inland that had great riches and much gold. And it hadn't been, very long at all since the Spanish had landed in what is now Mexico and had gone to war with the Aztecs there, later the Incas, and took a lot of gold from those people. So the Spanish were all about the gold. Well, a few years after this expedition, about 10 years after Cabeza de Vaca came back, he and his comrades with news of their travels, another expedition was mounted to find the fabled 7 cities of gold, and it was led by Francisco Coronado. They first went up into the area of New Mexico and attacked the Pueblo Indians there, the Zuni and the Hopi and others, looking for gold and not finding any. But they did find a Native American who was a slave, a captive who had been enslaved of the people they were attacking. And they called him the Turk, or El Turco. But probably he was a Caddoan-speaking person from the southern plains, and to save his life, because they were basically killing all the people that they had that they were encountering, who had fought against them, whom they had captured. To spare his own life, he told them that he could get them to those lost, fabled cities of gold. That there was a place called Quivira, far to the east, that was just people ate off gold plates and just walked on gold like it was just nothing. And that if only they would let him live, he would lead them there. And so they said sure, and he led them out into the desert, kind of wandering around in circles, really, because, well, he knew there was no gold. And each group of people that they encountered, when the Spaniards would demand, where's the gold? And essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, but the locals, wherever they went, would say, oh yeah, the yellow stuff you like so much, I think it's that way, sending them actually on more of a wild goose chase. Finally, they did wind up in Quivira, which was a Caddoan speaking group of people living in this area in eastern Kansas. They had gone through North Texas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and into southwest Kansas. Finally, they get to Quivira and discover that there's one copper necklace among all the people who live there. So that made them suspect that their guide had not been entirely upfront with them. So they strangled him to death, and eventually made their way back home, having found no golden cities, although other Spanish explorers would continue for several years afterward looking for those non-existent golden cities. The same sorts of tales arose in South America, where the fabled land of El Dorado the conquistadors were looking for unsuccessfully. So that was the introduction of Europeans to the southern plains. So the Spanish then approached the plains from the south. They'd made sort of a beachhead in Mexico, and once they did the same thing, established essentially another beachhead in New Mexico, they were then afterwards approaching the plains from that direction, from the east. About 100 years later, in the late 1600s, into the early 1700s, the French would be the second European power to enter the Great Plains, and they would come from the north, from Canada. So the first tribes they encountered were obviously those northern plains tribes. Now, the fact that the Spanish were the European influence in the southern plains and the French were the European influence in the northern plains helps explain why throughout history, a lot of the things we're going to talk about, all the way up to the 21st century, all the way up to American Indians who belong to these plains tribes today, those from the southern plains sometimes have Spanish surnames, and those from the northern plains often have French surnames. And as we'll see in a bit, the French also would approach from essentially New Orleans down there in the southeast. We talked before about the fact that horses were not native to the Americas, or at least had not been for many thousands of years, and were in fact reintroduced, or introduced in their modern form, by the Spanish initially, and that's how American Indians eventually got horses and started to have a horse culture. And if you're like me, you've always kind of believed, and there is some truth to this. This is what I was taught, that the way horses were introduced is that as the Spanish would make their way through in their exploration, sometimes some of their horses would get loose, or they would lose some horses, and they would wander off and become wild, and would sort of congregate with other loose and escaped horses and form whole herds of what are called mustangs, or wild horses, that then have to be captured and trained. And that did happen. But a lot of folks aren't aware that there was one specific incident that really greatly accelerated the introduction of horses, and particularly sort of indirectly led to the horse culture that would develop on the Great Plains. And it started not on the plains, but just a little bit southwest of there, in that same area where I just talked about Coronado attacking the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblos near the city that was established called Santa Fe in what was came to be known as New Mexico. Those Pueblos, once they were defeated by the Spanish, essentially were then occupied and controlled by the Spanish for a long time afterward, a very long time, 140 years after Coronado. They were still being controlled by the Spanish, forced to work for the Spanish, not only the soldiers, but they had brought a lot of priests along to convert the Indians, and the Indians weren't really given very much choice in that conversion. And there were also Spanish civilians that were brought along to establish farms and ranches. And the native people in all the areas that were occupied by Spain were doing the labor. And it was sort of like, well, today I guess you would call it a protection racket, in which you coerce people into doing something by telling them that you're actually protecting them from harm, and the harm is what you would do to them if they didn't do what you said. So the Pueblos were increasingly, generation by generation, having their rights eroded. Now, part of the deal was, though, that whole let us protect you, was to protect them from the Apaches and Navajos who lived nearby and liked to raid the Pueblos. But the Spanish weren't doing a very good job of that. There happened to be a drought, not a massive, decades-long one, like happened in the 13th, 14th century, but a drought, so that the Spanish just weren't doing a good job on their end of the bargain, and their end of the bargain wasn't very fair to begin with. And the Pueblos were getting more and more frustrated. And the final straw came when, at the urging of the priests, that is the Spanish priests, the Spanish cracked down on the Pueblos' practice of their native culture and their native religion. And in fact, they arrested their religious leader, their medicine man, whose name was Pope, put him in jail for a while. And when they let him out, Pope began communication secretly with the other Pueblos, planning a revolution. And so they successfully kept those plans a secret, and in 1680 did in fact rise up and strike back against their Spanish oppressors. They particularly were angry at the priests who had tried to stamp out their whole culture, they felt. So they killed most of them, have killed all of them, killed a good number of Spanish people. And the Spanish were forced to retreat from that area. And that was a big victory for the Indians, obviously. It was a temporary reprieve. About 20 years later, the Spanish came back with a very large army and reconquered the region. But they did buy themselves 20 years of living the way they wanted to live. All right? So, what does all this have to do with the Great Plains? Well, when the Spanish retreated, they didn't take all their stuff with them. And part of the stuff they didn't take was their horse herd. I imagine the horses that they could ride themselves, but they had large herds which were left behind. Now, there were actually laws in the areas under Spanish control, laws against Indians riding horses, because horses were for gentlemen, for cavaliers, for caballeros, knights in England, not common people. And the natives were considered as common as you can get or below common by the Spanish. So it was actually insulting to the dignity of a Spaniard at that time if they saw a Native American getting up on a horse. So there were strict penalties. So these horses are left behind. The Pueblo Indians, even though the Spanish had been there with their horses for the entire lifespan of all the Indians who were there, never really interacted with the horses that much, other than as servants, probably to feed and groom them. So they didn't have much use for these horses. And what they wound up doing was trading those horses to their neighbors to the north, the Utes. And the Utes kept some of them, but traded quite a few of them to their neighbors to the north, the Shoshone. And the Shoshone really took this horse business and ran with it, galloped, you might say. They got really good at breeding horses, at raising horses, and whereas the Utes lived up in the mountains and the Shoshones lived up in the mountains, once they got horses, the Shoshones ventured out onto the northern plains to hunt buffalo. And once they did that, then they started introducing the horse via trade to some of the other tribes in the area who had been, making their living by chasing buffalo off of cliffs, and now were able to get horses. So this whole horse culture was spreading in the north, and it also spread in the south, because one offshoot of the Shoshones kind of drifted south. They didn't really drift. They went there with a purpose. They were really good at horsemanship. They took to it quickly, and they wanted more horses. And if you want more horses, you got to go where the horses are. And that was the Spanish settlements. So this Shoshonian group traveled south to where there were more Spanish settlements that they could raid and take horses from. So we're talking about wandering down into Texas. And these are the people that came to be known as the Comanches. The Comanches, historically, for a very long time, and still today in books about the Comanches, have been regarded as some of the major superior horsemen in the world. And this is how they got their start, by originally being Shoshones, who got these horses through trades that had originated with the huge herd left behind by the Spanish at the time of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So there were also herds of Mustangs that were developing from, the odd random horse wandering off here and there. But so far as a big major impact all at once, that Pueblo Revolt was the major event that led eventually, and by eventually not very long at all, to the tribes throughout the plains now having horses. So that's the story of how horses were introduced to the Great Plains. Now let's talk about how guns were introduced to the Great Plains, but we're going to have to take kind of a roundabout route to get there. I guess we don't have to, but that's kind of how I roll. So we're first going to take a look at the Algonquin language group, the Algonquin-speaking tribes. And you can see they're spread out, like we talked about before, very well represented, much of Canada, all down the East Coast, a good part of the Midwest. As it turned out, the Algonquin-speaking tribes tended to form alliances with the French, whereas for example, the Iroquois, who dominated the areas that are not Algonquin up in the Northeast, the Iroquois and others were allies of the English. So looking at this map, maybe we should take a little bit closer look. All right, so you can see that there are Ojibwe all along the northern shores of the Great Lakes at the time of contact. Ojibwe or Ojibwa, and sometimes that was sort of mispronounced or pronounced in such a way by the American colonists that Ojibwa became Chippewa, which is where we get Chippewa. So Chippewa, Ojibwe, Ojibwa, all the same people. All of them speaking a subgroup language of Algonquin, of Anishinaabe. So you got the Ojibwe, north of them the Cree. So the Cree do not come into our story a whole lot because they're primarily in the northern plains of Canada. And then groups like the Menominee there in the Great Lakes area, the Ojibwe's close allies, the Ottawa and Potawatomi, over in the Illinois and Ohio region. You had the Miami, Illinois, and Shawnee, all of them allies of the French. And as you probably know, the French and the English were almost constantly at war with one another and bringing their Indian allies in on those wars. And that's why we're starting with speaking about the Algonquins, because it was that which set a lot of events in motion. The competition between the French and the English to dominate the fur trade, and the respective Native American allies of each of those colonial powers also wanted to dominate the native end of the fur trade. So there were a long series of wars that took place in the Northeast and the Great Lakes region, called the Beaver Wars, between basically the Iroquoian peoples and pretty much everybody else, for over 70 years, from 1629 to 1701. So you can take a look at the map there in the lower right, and it shows the original homeland of the Iroquois, or the correct French pronunciation would be Iroquois. I say Iroquois because it's the Americanized pronunciation. Their actual name is the Haudenosaunee, people of the Long Houses. But this magenta area in New York State, that's where their original territory was. But once they started trading, first with the Dutch in New York, and then when the English chased the Dutch out of New York and took over, then the English also took over the treaties and the trade obligations the Dutch had with the Iroquois. So the English become the big allies of the Iroquois. Again, the French were allies of all the Algonquin tribes, which was pretty much everybody else in the region. Now here's the rub. Early on, in the early and mid 1600s, the French did not believe in trading guns to their Indian trading partners. They kind of figured that to be a bad idea. The Spanish didn't necessarily trade guns on a big level either, out in the southwest. The Dutch did trade guns to the Iroquois, and the English continued that tradition. So the English are trading guns to their Iroquois allies. The French are not trading guns to their allies, which was pretty much everybody else. So guess what happens? The Iroquois have the guns, and they started to expand. And the Beaver Wars, what that really was is sort of this huge, massive expansion of the Iroquois, until eventually they controlled all that area in orange there, which is most of the Midwest and the Great Lakes area. And as they were doing that, they were pushing other peoples out of the area. Now, the Iroquois didn't move to Indiana or Illinois to go live. They were not settler colonists, which is what the English practiced, settler colonialism. What they wanted was to dominate the hunting in those areas, and therefore the fur trade. So they did actually chase a lot of people out. The Shawnees, who were from Ohio, were chased southward and wound up in Kentucky, and some groups even farther south than that in Georgia and Alabama. And then other groups were pushed westward. So this series of events that were tied into the gun trade had huge ripples that quickly spread all across the region. Now, eventually, the Spanish figured out that, we're at a huge disadvantage by our allies not having guns, but the Iroquois having guns. So they started trading guns then with their own allies. All right. Well, late 1600s, that's toward the end of these Beaver Wars. The French down in Louisiana were trading guns to the Caddoan tribes of Texas, like the Wichita and the Tejas. And they were trading those guns in return for horses, which were coming to them now from trade with the Comanches. So the Caddos start getting a lot of guns from the French. By 1720, the various Caddo tribes in Texas stopped using bows and arrows altogether, even for hunting. They exclusively started using guns, and they took the excess guns they were getting from the French and trading them to their own neighbors to the west, the Apaches and Comanches, who would then take those guns and raid the Spanish. The Caddos were receiving as a reward for being trading partners and allies of the French, kind of an annuity, an annual gift of a bunch of guns and supplies, powder and bullets, and so forth. So they've got even more guns coming in. When the Spanish took over New Orleans in 1763, they also took over that French trade, and then they continued trading the guns to the Caddos. Up in Canada at the same time, late 1600s, the French were trading guns to the Cree and Ojibwe. Ojibwe were close allies of the French. And the Ojibwe then start expanding rapidly. Now, they can't expand eastward because they can't expand too far eastward or southward because the Iroquois have already expanded there. They're at the height of their powers. But they do extend southwest and to the west. And that leads to the similar sort of thing happening. Other groups in the Great Lakes region that are not members of the Ojibwe alliance, which they have with the Ottawa and the Potawatomi, they get pushed out onto the plains. So pressure from both the Iroquois and the Ojibwe. Something's got to give. This is how the Lakota Sioux wound up leaving the Great Lakes region, leaving their woodland, eastern woodland Indian traditions and heading out onto the plains. The Blackfeet, by 1730, the Blackfeet were getting guns, probably through trade with the Cree. And up to this point, the Shoshones, for 50 years or more, or around 50 years, had dominated the northern plains. Because remember, the Shoshones were the first ones that had horses up there. And so they took full advantage of that. And so they wound up on top for a while. But now the Blackfeet have some horses, but they've also got a lot of guns, and the Shoshones didn't have any guns. So the Blackfeet decisively defeated them, and that was the end of Shoshone dominance in the area, though they would still be a powerful player in the region for the next century thereafter. By the 1760s, the English from forts in Illinois were trading guns to the Plains and Prairie tribes, particularly the Mandan. The Mandan wound up being sort of the gun dealers of the North, as the Caddo were in the South. By 1790s, everybody in the region is pretty well armed. Guns, after the passage of about a century, guns have become a part of life for all the Plains tribes, and so it's no longer a matter of one has guns and one doesn't. Everybody pretty much does. And the trade continued from the Europeans. The French initially, they didn't trade guns to the Indians because they were afraid, what happens if something happens and we don't get along, then the Indians can shoot us. But they eventually did start arming them. And the reason is the same reason the English and the Spanish did. Each of these European powers were hoping that the Indians they traded with would take those guns and shoot the other Europeans, right? So both the English and the French were trading guns to the Southern Plains tribes, hoping they would go make trouble for the Spanish and kill some Spanish people. And up in the north, the English and the French were doing the same thing, hoping that the English hoping the French would get shot, and the French hoping the English would get shot. So eventually, everybody was happily shooting together, I guess. So I've mentioned trade quite a bit. By the 1700s, there was an ever-increasing trading network that was all up and down the plains area that connected the plains with other regions. In each particular area, maybe one tribe would dominate the trade there. You can see all these blue circles. That's the sort of the trade dominance of various tribes. But you'll notice the Hidatsa and the Mandan are in the same circle together. By then, they're practically living together, close allies. The Arikara, who had been their enemies once upon a time, have now become their allies as well. So those three tribes are together in that green circle. The three of them dominate the trade in the northern plains. Now, there's some smaller circles that are different rendezvous. A rendezvous was a big trade fair that happened once a year that people came from all over. So the Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara, they didn't have a big rendezvous. Their rendezvous was all day, every day, all year long. There were Indians from all the tribes in the region trekking back and forth in and out of the villages of the Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara. But everybody went to these rendezvous. There was the Dakota rendezvous that was essentially hosted by the Sioux. And farther to the west, up in the mountains, there was the Shoshone rendezvous. And way out on the west coast, the Dalles in Oregon, Dalles rendezvous, which was the hub of the extremely rich trade of the Pacific Northwest. Some people have referred to the Dalles rendezvous as the Wall Street of the West. They were getting stuff all the way down from Alaska. So the Shoshone, you'll notice, are centrally located so that they can trade both with the Plains tribes and with the Pacific Northwest tribes. And therefore, you've got stuff that the Pacific Northwestern tribes are trading that maybe they got all the way from Alaska, making its way to Missouri, to the plains. Now, down in the south, the Comanches had established basically their own huge trade empire through much of West Texas and a big chunk of New Mexico, parts of Arizona, and northern Mexico. And we'll talk in more detail about that. Actually, what we're going to do later is talk about each of the tribes in turn, from the etymology of their names to their origin and what regions they came from, to their basic beliefs and their language groups and everything. So one more thing that I want to mention here is that in addition to these trading areas, just to the north of the Comanches, there in New Mexico, there was the Pecos, the pueblos along the Pecos River that had been a trade hub since before the Europeans showed up, all the way back in the 15th century. This is a painting purported to show an image from circa 1500. So people would come from all over the region to go there. And so they were the connection then to the rest of the Southwest, them and the Comanches. So let's look at this map one more time. This map of late arrivals onto the plains. And now we've talked about the events that set other events in motion that led to the movement of many of these people, particularly the ones that moved deeper into the plains. Like the Black Arrows there, the Ponca, Odo, Iowa, and etc. They didn't move right out onto the plains. They moved up to the edge of the plains, eastern Kansas, eastern Nebraska, maybe a little bit of northeastern Oklahoma at first. But those other bigger arrows, people who traveled from farther, including the ones who were pushed out from the Great Lakes, like the Cheyenne and the Lakota Sioux, they're coming out onto the plains now because they have horses. And horses can just make all the difference in being able to sustain larger groups of people on the semi-arid plains, living off of hunting buffalo, which, despite all the tricks people had come up with over the millennia, is still a pretty hard thing to do on foot. So now we have set things in motion for the modern tribes as we know them to be in the places that we associate them with, and to be interacting with the colonial European powers, but very soon the new power of the United States of America that's going to be moving into the region.